hope we agree that public service is a public trust, especially with an office like yours, which is entrusted with overseeing vast public resources for the American people. So let's start with a basic question. Do you agree that our ethics rules exist not just to avoid actual conflicts of interest, but to avoid the appearance of a conflict so that the public can have trust and confidence in our government?
Well, I would say that 2635 CFR 502.
It's a yes or no question, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, addresses
Thank
impartiality.
you. Thank you. And I know that same standard is reflected in your own recusal letter. Mr. Secretary, before you joined the administration, you were a lobbyist and lawyer for the Westlands Water District. And your work for that client included lobbying on the WIN Act, signed into law in late 2016, correct?
I worked on, I certainly worked at different times on provisions that were included within the WIN Act, yes.
Right. Now, Mr. Secretary, the WIN Act was a huge water bill. It had lots of sections. It had WRDA, all of these Corps of Engineers provisions, had some money for Flint, Michigan, water needs, recycling, desalination, some tribal water rights settlements. You didn't lobby on any of those sections. You're lobbying for Westlands, focused on efforts to increase Central Valley Project pumping from the Delta, specifically sections 4001 and 4003 of Subtitle J of the WIN Act, correct?
I think it was more focused on 4002.
Okay, but specific sections involving Delta operations that affected Westlands, correct?
I certainly would say 4002 falls into that category.
Right.
And I'm not sure I would say that it affects Westlands necessarily, but it's certainly that provision.
Well, Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, those two specific sections involving Delta operations were a giant thumb on the scale against endangered fish in the Delta and in favor of the Westlands Water District. It was your thumb when you helped write those sections, and by the way, you'd been advocating for these things for several years on behalf of Westlands, and it's your thumb now as the person in charge of interpreting these laws and implementing them. But your lobbying work for Westlands on these things didn't count. You would argue it didn't even count toward your 2-year recusal under the Trump Ethics Pledge, correct?
Before I was even seriously considering coming into the department as deputy, I told Secretary Zinke that before I did that.
Mr. Secretary, I don't have time for a narrative. The question is, did your lobbying for Westlands on these specific sections of the WIN Act count toward your 2-year recusal under the Trump Ethics Pledge?
Those specific activities regarding Public Law 114322, which is the WIN Act, those activities were viewed to not constitute lobbying on a particular matter, which
right, and that's significant.
Which is a specific term
reclaiming
of
my
art,
time. That's a specific term of art. This is my time, Mr. Secretary. It's important that you use that parsed specific term of art, because even though there were specific sections benefiting your client, if you can say that they didn't constitute a particular matter, you got a 5-month head start working on those things on behalf of Westlands as Secretary of Interior. You got 5 months in which your recusal didn't apply, correct?
It's not it's not my view. What I did is I went to the career ethics officials.
And you convinced him that didn't constitute a particular matter. Do you think, Mr. Secretary, by parsing in that way, do you think you're upholding the standard of ethics we talked about at the beginning of my question?
I absolutely do, because 502, impartiality, goes to particular matters involving specific parties. And my action is completely consistent with OGE guidance, guidance from my ethics officials, and I have followed their guidance to a T. And that's been reaffirmed in multiple efforts.
Mr. Secretary, Westlands was by no means your only client. You also represented the Independent Petroleum Association of America. I'm sure you're aware of how your former clients in the oil and gas industry have boasted about their special access to you. At a 2017 meeting, Dan Natz, the director of the IPAA, boasted about how well he knew you, saying, quote, "We have direct access to him, conversations about issues ranging from federal land access to the ESA. This was during your recusal. Was he just confused about who he thought he was talking to during this period?
Well, I can say emphatically, I haven't talked to Dan Knotts since I walked into the department.
So he was just
Probably-
wrong when he told a room full of oil and gas executives that he was having these conversations
He
with you?
certainly didn't have any conversations with me when I got to Interior a day after, or
Thank you,
any
Mr.
day after that.